coming up to the hour. Today's topic for today's webinar is a forecasting masterclass, which I think is going to be absolutely fascinating, and as the economy gets going, I think is going to be very important to get the forecasts as accurate as we possibly can. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to be doing the introductions and sharing. I'm the editor of Call Center Helper. I'm joined also by Penny Reynolds, contributor to our workforce management series of webinars. Welcome to you, Penny.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And Penny is going to be talking through forecasting techniques and also a section on forecast accuracy, which I think is going to be great. Dean Couchman from Injixo, welcome to you.
Welcome. Thank you for having us.
And Dean is going to be taking us through a section of forecasting in action that includes a real-life demonstration of some forecasting software in action. We're also joined by another regular, Chris Steely. Welcome to you.
Hello, John T. Good afternoon, everybody.
And Chris is going to be going through a short section on forecasting in the cloud, which I think will be very good to see. You also have the chance to put in your top tips and questions, which we'll be doing through our chat room. And you can also get the slides through it, callcenterhelper.com/chat. And if you leave your tips and questions in there, there's a bottle of champagne or a box of chocolates for the best tip that we have going through. And if you want to watch a replay of today's webinar, it's on the same link as you've dialed into today. So go into the chat room. Very simple. Here's the URL. Just some simple rules. No commercial messages in there, and please put web addresses or emails only through direct messages. And as ever, please keep it nice and polite. You can go in, download the slides through the link on that, so that should work out quite well. But before we get going, what I'd like to do is just put up a poll and just like to explore with you what method you use to forecast currently. So do you use workforce management software? Do you use specialist forecasting software? Do you use Excel? Have you got a manual forecast, or are you not sure about the forecasting method? So I'd just like to vote on that, then it would be quite fascinating to see. You can select all that apply. So if you use, for instance, a selection of Excel plus workforce management software, you can certainly put them in there. So let's just share the results here up on the screen. We have a sample size of 142, and the biggest one on here, 68% using Excel and 49% using workforce management software, with 25% using a manual forecast. So Penny, looks like there's quite a crossover between people using workforce management and Excel as well. Is that sort of very common in your view?
It absolutely is. There are many people that rely on their workforce management software and the forecasting mechanism, but many people have been doing it with Excel for years, and I like to kind of rely on that piece too and marry them up, put them together, so it's not surprising to see that at all. I think as we see workforce management software getting a little bit better and a little bit more accurate, there's a little bit less reliance perhaps on Excel. So we may be exploring some of that later in the class.
So what I'd also like to do, and we can do this through the chat room, is I'd like everyone in the audience, just in one or two words, to put into the chat room, what is your biggest headache that you have with forecasting? So just like to put into the chat room, which is at callcenterhelper.com/chat. What is your biggest headache with forecasting? So let's have a look at some of the results. Alex says it's ad hoc or firefighting. Colin says relationships and communication. Alex, 2, forecasting in small intervals. Keeping at the right level of detail, says Andy. Jesse says we're unable to commit the time to it. We've got marketing campaigns. In fact, a lot of ones coming through here. Use of marketing campaigns. uncommunicated mailings, communication. Others knowing what or knowing what others are doing can directly affect call volumes. Insight and change management, multi-skill time and time zones. So quite a range of different topics. Forecasting small volumes, quite an interesting one. Terry says it's shrinkage. Rena says changes in productivity. Vincent also shrinkage. So there's quite a range of different topics there, Penny, that are coming up. But a lot of them seem to be almost dealing with the unexpected.
Right, and unfortunately, some of that unexpected should be known. I mean, when you say the biggest headache is marketing, it's not that they're so bad, but it's just, would they please tell us what's going on? So sometimes you read about it on the website or in the news along with everybody else that's now calling you. So sometimes one of our forecasting tips perhaps should be to forge a better relationship with the marketing department or those responsible for generating calls and understanding what impact they're going to have on the center. Absolutely.
Indeed, we've got a few others coming through. Multilingual, says Carmen. Amy is saying cleansing historic information to get a baseline. And Jesse is saying a lack of anecdotal information from operations. So we're getting a number of ones about seasonality and unpredictability. So it looks like we've got quite a number of headaches there. So I think it's probably the right time to pass the baton now across to Penny Reynolds, who'll be taking us through some of the techniques that we can use to certainly deal with seasonality and forecast accuracy and the like. So Penny, if you'd like to line up your presentation and take us through some of the techniques that we can use.
Okay, well, hello everyone, and we're going to be talking today about 5 different areas. We only have a little under an hour to do this. We typically teach forecasting classes that are 1 or 2 days in length, so we had to pick out some highlights of that. So we're going to be exploring today first just a little bit about the different forecasting models, what's most commonly used, what's good and bad about those, and what the most common approaches are. We'll talk about one approach in particular, which is time series analysis, and talk about what that means, what are the 3 components, and what are some of the important things to understand about trend and seasonality and cycle predictions. Then we're going to talk just a minute about we can't let forecasting go without talking about good data in and good forecast out. So talk a little bit about historical data and what to look for with respect to the aberrations and someone mentioned in the chat room the cleansing of the data. We're going to talk a little bit about how to do that, and also how to just sort of keep track and preserve some of those important anomalies and aberrations and patterns for the future. Then we're going to take a look at how you measure your success in forecasting, and it's very important to always look at how are we going to get better at this. And so you want to have some ways to look at your accuracy of forecasting. And so I'm going to show you 3 different approaches. One is the most common approach, but I also want to point out what's inherently kind of a problem with the most common approach to doing this, and what are some other mathematical techniques that you might want to use. We actually touched on this in another webinar with Call Center Helper, and it was a popular topic, so we decided to bring it back for a few minutes in this class too. And then at the end, we're going to take a look at what are some of the new tools out there that can really help you get a better handle on forecasting. So with that, let's get started. Here are some of the models. And the first of these, point estimation, very simple. We're going to move into averaging approaches and then talk a little bit about time series. Regression analysis is another model that's used sometimes, and it's very appropriate in some situations. So for those of you that were saying our forecast is off because of marketing, if you're very event-driven, so that how many calls you get depends on how many catalogs you drop or how many TV spots you run or that sort of thing, then you are less reliant on history, actually, than these events. And regression analysis is a way to go with those. But in my experience, about 95% of contact centers other approaches actually work better. And if you have time to go out and Google and look at forecasting approaches, you can see that there's about a dozen out there. But again, limited time today. We're just going to focus on a few of these. Some of the most common ones. One very common approach is just point estimation, and it's the very simplest thing you could possibly do. It's essentially saying one point in time, the next point in time like it is going to be just like it. So if we look at the temperature outside today on the first Thursday in May, and we try and predict next year for the first Thursday in May, probably a pretty good guess as to what it's going to be like. But in call center forecasting, obviously point estimation doesn't recognize any trend that's been going on in your calling, any growth, any decline, can't account for any short-term changes or any particular unique events on that particular day, or if even you have good data for the first point. So obviously this one, not the most accurate approach. Some other possibilities are various averaging approaches. And so if you look at the screen there, you see 5 weeks of data. I want to say this is what happened, this is how many calls you received from 8 to 9 a.m. on on Thursdays. Then what would the next one in the series be? Well, if we do a simple average and just average those 5 numbers together, we get 94.2. Probably not the best prediction of what's going to happen next, because you can see there's a gradual kind of upward movement in those numbers. So averaging together all those is pulling in too much old data, and that's probably not a good prediction for the future. You could do a moving average where you're throwing out the old data and only looking at the most recent 2 or 3 events. That's going to get you a little bit better at 96, so we're getting a little closer, but still not the next number in the series. And a weighted average, where instead of giving a 20% or equal weight to all of those 5 weeks as predictors, we give a much heavier weight to the last 2 weeks and then declining weights to the others. But once again, we never get the next number in the series. And so that's why averaging approaches, and there are all kinds of averaging approaches beyond these 3. There is an approach called exponential smoothing that's somewhat common in workforce management packages. But essentially what it's doing is taking the highest pieces and the lowest pieces, kind of dropping those out, kind of like the Olympics scoring, and sort of averaging the others. But when you do that, you're getting rid of maybe some important information and patterns in that, and therefore it's not always the best approach. So you want to think about, is there a pattern, is there a trend going on, and if there is an upward or a downward trend, an averaging approach is not going to catch that and give you the next number in the series. Now it is appropriate perhaps if you're looking at your average handle time, if there's no trend in the handle time, and there tends to be less of one there, or for even things like shrinkage over time or things like that. So averaging approaches can be used, but probably not the approach you want to use for predicting actual call volume. The approach that is most commonly used in call centers for forecasting is something called time series. And most call centers use this. Most workforce management software packages that have a forecasting mechanism rely on this to some degree. And all it is saying we're looking at what happens to this information over time, how time influences it. So the 2 primary components of time series will be the trend, that's the underlying change in the data, and the seasonality. And we typically think of seasonality as month to month. Why is July different than December? But it can also be seasonality in terms of even the weeks of the month and how one week may be higher or lower than others. So like I said, the 2 primary components excuse me, are trend, the long-term rate of change, and it's often just the growth rate in the data. It's not that difficult. And then the seasonality, most commonly the month-to-month fluctuation in calls. Another component of time series, we'll be looking at cycles, and cycles are very important for many contact centers in that because of a billing cycle or any other reason that there's a normal pattern that occurs month to month or quarter to quarter or whatever the case may be, those repeatable patterns are also influenced over time, primarily due to business influences, so you want to be on the watch for those as well. And of course there's math behind all three of these as to how you calculate these. For those of you that are interested, we'll supply some articles that take you through some how-to steps of calculating trend and seasonality and cycles, so you can take a closer look at those. One of the important things I want to point out, though, about time series analysis is excuse me, the difference between the trend and seasonality, and it's really important that we separate those two because as you're looking at this chart and you're looking at here's what happened last year, and you see out there, let's just take a look at November and December. The blue line there is the actual that occurred. That gray straight line is our trend line. So you can see that this call center is experiencing a steady kind of upward growth. But some months of the year are higher or lower than others. So if you're trying to use this as a predictor and you're looking at what happened in November and December, is December higher than November because of trend, because it's a month later? Or is it higher because December is a busier month in our holiday ordering period? And the answer is probably both. But what you want to know is what is the seasonal impact of each month? And if you try and compare just looking at last November and December, or October, November, and December, you have the two intertwined. If you just look at the raw data, part of it's due to trend, but part of it's due to seasonality. You really want to understand those seasonal factors. So there's a process within time series that is called detrending, and essentially what it's doing is bringing up data to the current point in time. So we would take November data, the real data, and give it 1 month's worth of trend or growth rate to get it equalized with December, and then we could compare those two numbers to say, well, here's the true seasonal difference between November and December. For October, if December is our most current month, we would grow October up 2 months to say what would October have looked like if it had had 2 more months worth of growth or trend experienced, and then you could look at them with an equal comparison with respect to seasonality. So I just wanted to point that out because sometimes we get our data all, it has both of those influences in it, and to do a good forecast you want to understand each individual component. So to get to those seasonal numbers, you can't just look at your last 12 months and say, well, here's the percentage of the year that July was. You know, it's got trend wrapped up in it too. So you want to remove those two pieces as you look at your long-term forecasts. Another part of creating good forecasts has to do with getting good data in the first place. And so there's nothing more important. You know, we always hear garbage in, garbage out. I mean, it's so true. You put so much effort into this forecast and then into these staffing calculations and then into these carefully constructed schedule plans. But if the data going into that was bad in the first place, you've surely wasted a whole lot of time and effort. So we want to make sure that the data is cleansed, it's reviewed carefully before it's allowed to enter the forecasting process. So we want to look for aberrations, and aberrations is anything that's sort of out of the ordinary. You can be experiencing aberrations that are extremely high because of some reason. Maybe it's a news event, maybe it's an announcement from your company, it could be the weather. Anything could happen, so you've got an extreme. Well, what you have to ask yourself is extreme enough to be considered an aberration, and then secondly, does it have predictive value? So will this happen again? Yes, it's high, it's out of the ordinary, but will it happen again just on a regular basis? If so, it's not really an aberration, it has predictive value. It may be an aberration that it has predictive value, but not for very much of the time. Maybe it's just predictive value if this news event happens again, or after this holiday occurs. So if so, it's a useful aberration that we're going to save it and pull it aside and use it for the future. But many of these we want to normalized. An aberration can also be an unusually
And Penny, is there a difference in name between where there is whether it's a predictable aberration or if it's, for instance, like a system failure where the computer system went down?
Well, they're all sort of referred to as aberrations or just anomalies. And I guess you can call them whatever you want in your own center. But some of them are good aberrations or usable, and then some are just bad data. And we want to make sure we get them thrown out or normalized to here's what it would normally look like and what we expect to happen in the future. But yeah, but be on the lookout for the unusually flat patterns too, because those can be aberrations. That could be, once again, no one's calling because of that major television show that's on, or a news event, or the weather, or maybe they're calling and business is going as usual and you're taking calls, but maybe the link from your ACD into the workforce management system is down. Or maybe people were trying to call you, the call volume is normal, but you had telephone trunks blocked for some reason. So the calls weren't getting in the door to get recorded to even be in your data. So look for highs, look for lows, anything that looks just sort of odd and unusual. You want to examine it and make sure you know what to do with it. The other thing you want to do is just keep a keep a journal. And it can be an online kind of thing. Maybe it's built into the workforce management tool you have. But short of that, just a little notebook you keep at your desk every day. So you're noting what's going on today. Beautiful weather, or major tornadoes coming through, or press release from marketing went out today, or the monthly statements were delayed 2 days in going out. Because as you look back at your data later on, sometimes you're not looking at it until a month later, or several months later. And I can't remember what happened yesterday, let alone what happened 3 months ago. So going back to say, oh, we had a big anomaly on the 25th of April. Well, what happened on the 25th of April? So going back to that journal can really help you think through, okay, well, that was normal and expected and it will happen again, or nope, that was just bad data and let's normalize it. So that little journal is a real must-have as you're looking at your data. The next thing we want to talk about is measuring forecasts and how good are you at this. Once again, you can put a lot of effort into this, but if the accuracy of it's not so good, your schedules and everything else down the road are going to be off. So we really want to make sure that we're using the right approaches, we're understanding our data properly so that we've got good historical data going in, we understand the business drivers that are influencing it, and we just understand the numbers, because this really does serve as the foundation going forward. There are three basic ways to calculate forecast accuracy, and the most common approach is just a real simple mathematical approach to look at here's what I forecast, here's what we really had, and what's the difference in those, what's the percentage difference. So that's the most common approach. But then there are two others that I want to mention, because this percent difference can get us into some trouble. So let's take a look at this. Here's what happens sometimes as we're looking at percent differences. So what you see in this example, forecast volumes and then the actuals, and you can see that we have essentially underpredicted most of the time, but still a pretty good forecast overall. So we're at about a 4% overall for the week. Most call centers would be delighted with this, actually. So we're calculating the forecast compared to the actual, and just comparing the two for a percent difference. So pretty simple math. Here's another example. And in this one, wow, we got even closer. So if you look at this one and you're just looking at, hey, how'd we do for the week? Well, gosh, it looks like we're fabulous here. We're less than 1% in terms of accuracy. But, I mean, look at what happened for the week. Some days we're way under, some days we're way over. But gosh, at the end of the week, it kind of averaged out for us. The problem here is that many call centers look at their forecast accuracy by week, and something like this could actually happen. So some days you're high, some days you're low, and at the end of the week it looks like you are ready for a celebration when in fact it was really kind of a mess. So you look at these, and which of these would you rather have? And while you look at the percent accuracy, you say, well, I'd rather be less than 1%. Well, look at the differences that contributed to that. So if you're using just percent difference and you're calculating it this way, you may be kidding yourself with how well you did for the week. The pluses and the minuses will tend to cancel themselves out, and it looks pretty good as the average. So that's one reason that you really have to be careful with this percent difference kind of approach. A better approach, perhaps, is another mathematical technique called standard deviation. And what we're looking at here is not the average, but we're looking at the amount of variation. And I really think it's probably the best way to look at your forecast accuracy. And all of these approaches are easy to do in Excel, of course. Percent difference is easy to do. So is standard deviation. I put this up here just to show you where you find that in Excel, in case some of you are looking to do that. So looking at a standard deviation is going to give you a much truer story of, okay, how well do we do here? So if you look at those percent differences there, you see that the pluses and the minuses are there, and then you get a standard deviation calculated, which that's a high one, and so that ought to raise a red flag that, hey, we need to re-examine something here. So taking into account the variation and not just the percent difference, much better way to look at it. Another approach is looking at something called correlation coefficients, and this is another mathematical approach where you're looking at the relationship between variables. And there's also an Excel function for this. You can go out and get the slides for this presentation, so I'm not going to take you through these 9 steps of how to set that up in Excel. But if you're interested, you can get the copy of the slides and work through this. But the correlation...
And just a reminder that to get a copy of the slides, if you log into the chat room, callcenterhelp.com/chat, and in the top right-hand side is the download webinar slides button link.
Great. But this one's looking at relationships. And what you're looking for is if something is has good predictive value, then we'll have a correlation of 1 or 100%. So while week 1 and week 2 here looks like these are like wildly different numbers, there's actually a very strong relationship between those in terms of week 1 being, I don't know, 3 times higher than week 2, exactly. So this can be something that would help you predict if you have that one week of the month that's much higher than others. You're looking at one compared to another and what is the relationship in those numbers, and this is an exact relationship here. So even though those numbers are very different, there's a very strong relationship in those numbers compared to something like this, where the total at the end of the week is right on target. They're the same, but as you can see, the pattern is very, very different, and using correlation coefficients would show you that there's actually a very weak correlation between those numbers. This is a cool technique to use for so many different things. I'm not just testing forecast accuracy, but looking at so many different things. We're looking at how one thing compares to another and how the two are related. So you could look at what is your occupancy rate at various times of day, and then what are the quality scores that go along with it, or what about handle time and sales per call, or you name it. There are dozens and dozens of interesting relationships between numbers in your contact center. So this is a great tool to use. So if you're not familiar with it or comfortable with it, I would suggest going out and Googling and take a little class or something and learn how to use this. It's easy to use in Excel and can give you just a really good insight into lots of numbers that I think you'll find useful. So 3 approaches, but the key here is you want to look at your accuracy, and there's going to be some important questions to ask we're going to talk about in just a second. But Jonty, I think you wanted to do a poll right here about forecast accuracy.
Indeed, we're going to go across and we're going to put up a poll where we're going to ask how accurate are your forecasts. We're not going to put percentages up on the screen because it all depends on which method you have used to calculate them. So here are the answers that you can put up. Good forecasts most of the time. Good apart from surges in demand. Reasonable, poor, or awful, or very poor. So if you'd just like to vote on how accurate your forecasts are, if you've got any other answers, any percentages or correlations you'd like to put into the, if you'd like to add those into the chat room, that would be great. So the answer is good most of the time, good apart from surges in demand, reasonable or awful, and let's share the results up on the screen. Well, I think, Penny, a lot of people are in need of this masterclass because it's 15% good most of the time, 30% good apart from surges in demand, and 57% at reasonable. Good news is there's not many people down at the poor level, so
and nobody at awful. I'm glad to see nobody saying awful.
Whether they'd admit to that, I don't know. Yeah, so what I'd like to do now is I'd just like to drill down on that, and I'd just like to ask the question of the audience: what is holding you back in making your forecasts more accurate? Is it some of the headaches we've heard about earlier? Is it a lack of technology? Is it lack of knowledge on forecasting theories? So if you'd just like to type that into the chat room. And Charlotte says it's time that's holding her back. John is saying understanding external factors. Marvin says my company forecast a weekly volume that applies a run rate. So I don't know if that allows flexibility within the week. Communication breakdown with marketing. That's quite a common one, I would imagine. Forecasting for new events or events with changing deadlines, customer behavior, says Steve. Tracy says knowledge and no correlation between order and inquiry. Forecasting theory, says Khaled. Kathy is time and knowledge, she with time in there. Gideon, lack of knowledge. Eric, similar knowledge about the theories. Andrew says communication and inputs. Chris, standardized agent requirements. Time and forecasting come in. Emil says seasonal factors are one of the things that are holding back. Certainly, one of the problems with seasonality, I guess, is that it takes a while to build up the seasonal information. And if you haven't got, say, often 3 years worth of data, it's quite difficult to get the forecasts very accurate.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jonty. And we're often asked, how much data do you need to create forecasts? And we typically say, well, 2 years. 2 years if it's available and if it's relevant. It's good because that's enough to show the trends that are going on, and it also is a really good sort of snapshot of the seasonality that you have. I mean, you can do it with 1 year. 2 years is really ideal. 3 years, sure, maybe even just a little bit better. Also, sometimes you just see an aging of what's going on with the business and whatever that it can sometimes not really be needed or useful. But 2 years is ideal if it's available and if it's relevant. 1 year is fine, and then sometimes you have nothing to work with. So there's where you've got to go to that. We say forecasting is an art and a science. Well, there's where you've got to go to the art part. So the intuition, the judgment, looking at other businesses and what they do. Getting some smart minds in the room and talking about what could happen. So some people have actually no data to work with. That's a challenge in itself. Some final thoughts on calculating accuracy. I mean, I think you have to ask yourself, do you trust the forecast you're providing? And while many people say, there were a lot of that said, yeah, it's reasonable. Do you think it's reasonable enough or good enough to stake your bonus on it? Or enough to, say, nope, we're building schedules on this and we're denying a week of vacation to a hardworking person because, we trust this forecast so much. So is it really where you want it to be? The other thing is you may have different goals based on size. So someone mentioned in the chat room a headache with forecasting for small groups, small volumes. Yeah, that's really hard. The bigger the volume, the more consistency. That it takes some of the randomness out of it, I think, and the smaller the groups, and if you've got some skills that are getting so few calls, well, it's really hard to forecast for that, and hard to do anything meaningful, really. The third one there, also the accuracy goals, I think probably should be different. So we're asked all the time, okay, so what is the industry standard for what should my forecast accuracy be? Well, better than it is right now. You can always get it a little bit better. So if you're at 20% off, let's shoot for 15. If you're at 10, let's shoot for 8. If you're at 8, let's shoot for 5. I mean, you should always be working to get it a little better. But I think that it's most important to make sure you're getting it right during the periods of time when you're getting most of your calls. If there are other periods where it's very insignificant, I mean, it's not as impactful as being really far off during the busiest and most important times of your call handling period. And one more thought there. I don't have it on the screen, but one more thought. I attended a conference recently, and the speaker was the author of the book Moneyball, which was a movie with Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill. But it was a movie about the Oakland Athletics baseball team here in the U.S., whatever. But he was a great speaker because he was talking about the power of data and what we can do with it. And if you're not familiar with that story, it's essentially they took the worst performing baseball team in the league, and they just looked at what each player could do. They took the cheapest possible players, but what they could do well and they just constantly analyzed statistics and other team statistics, and in a year they kind of turned this whole team around. But anyway, he was talking about the power of understanding and analyzing data, and one of the things he said was, and it applies here, I think, is when things have gone well, don't just open the bottle of champagne. I mean, you should be applying the same thought into, why did this go well? What did I get right here? Or did I was 10% over on what I thought about this, but 10% under here, and it saved me, but I really had two components that were really off. So even with forecasts that are right on target, you still want to go in and examine, why was this good? So you should be constantly looking at that data with those thoughts in mind. Okay. Our fifth tip, where we're going to look at some forecasting tools. I mean, this whole process, many of you said, what's your biggest headache, what's your biggest impediment? And you said time. Yeah, I understand, because this is a very laborious process of looking at all this data, and even if you've got tools like Excel or whatever, it's very time consuming and prone to a lot of error, quite frankly. So it's hard. It's very hard. So to always be on the lookout for tools that can help get us through this. So the good news is there are some really cool new things out there that you want to take a look at, and Dean and Chris are going to take us through some examples of these.
So just before we jump across to that, we're going to take some examples of tips from the audience and a couple of audience questions. So Penny, if you can stay on the line, we'll run through that, and we'll bring in
Sure.
Dean and Chris for these as well. So we've got quite a number of tips and questions. Just a reminder, if you go into our chat room, callcenterhelper.com/chat would be good to go and see that. So the first one that we have is an audience tip, and it's a good idea to ask your marketing team and sales team to keep you in the loop for any planned promotion with complete details on communication and target base to have an accurate forecast. So Dean, I know you're a big fan of building links with marketing. Is quite an important factor on there. What's your view on best ways to go about building those links?
I think the big one is have a regular meeting with them, even if it's a weekly update, just so you're not being missed out even by accident. So you're always in that loop, you're always in the feedback that's coming in from the marketing. But more importantly, I've found in the past is not just being part of those discussions and knowing what's going on, but having realistic response rates. So not only targeting 20,000 customers, and obviously marketing always says, oh, we're going to get 5,000 responses from this. What's the realistic value? They might say 5,000, but you actually see an increase of 2,000 maybe over the week or however long. It's being realistic with it as well. It's not just the total. It's having that realistic feedback.
I got quite a nice tip, thank you, Dean, for Chris here. Remember, not all months have the same number of days or identical days year on year. May be important if weekend volumes are different. So it's worth comparing like for like. So, Chris, do you believe it's sort of forecasting months is the best way, or is it better to forecast on a weekly basis? I know there's 52 in a year to forecast rather than 12. What's your take on that? Chris, have we lost you?
Yep.
We'll see if we may have lost Chris there. We'll see if we can bring Chris back in a short while. Penny, so we've got I think something largely ties in what you were saying. Organize and track your historical data. Past trends will help shape future events, whether it be bank holidays or marketing response, or even guess things like sporting events like the World Cup, which is coming up in a month or so's time, is going to cause some quite big deviations. But I guess a lot of that ties in with your sort of planned. I can't remember the word you used, but sort of planned variances.
Absolutely, and that's where I was talking about, keeping that journal and understanding what happened in the past with the bank holiday, with this kind of marketing campaign versus that kind, that news event, that sporting event. I know some happen so, infrequently, like World Cup, that you may not know what happened during the last World Cup. You weren't in business then, or it didn't have that same impact. So some of these you're going to have to guess at just a little bit. But you can talk to other centers. You also want to, another tool in your toolkit is building relationships with other forecasters in other centers, and getting tips just like you're doing here with, what do they do? What have they found useful? What happened last time with World Cup? What patterns did they see? Really important to have those relationships in place.
Wonderful. Chris, are you back online?
Yes, I am. I'm sorry about that. There was a call on the other line and I muted myself.
Aha. So there's quite a nice one here from Steve who says, take the frustrations generated by ad hoc, unplanned actions by other areas of the business. Someone must have thought about and planned the action. Who? Engage those areas and educate them on the impact of the unknown and work together to make it known. My annual resource plan is built and regularly reviewed by full input from marketing and proposition teams. I think it's an excellent tip, Chris.
I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but you can never have too much communication between departments. However you best achieve that will depend on the organisation of your company. I mean, Dean mentioned his experience, which worked very well, having regular meetings. But at the end of the day, we're all in the same boat. If we do a marketing campaign or whatever, if the call centre's not set up to handle that, then it's not going to succeed.
Indeed. And on communication, here's another communication one. Give staff an easy way to let them see any change in type of calls or inquiries they're dealing. So I guess if a trend out of the norm comes through, try and communicate that off as best as possible. And Dean, here's one. Track reasons for calls to be able to allow the root cause for customer demand, which allows you to best understand your calls patterns and trends. And enables understanding the aberrations.
Totally agree. It's not just when are they coming in, it's also why. It's not necessarily something within your internal business. There could be something happening like you highlighted this morning with the weather forecasting that might make a massive change to everything. That can have a massive knock-on effect to everything. And it just shows that you need range.
And we've got a tip in from Emma. So dealing with your abnormal data, Penny, who suggests that rather than just eyeballing the abnormal data, calculate minimum and maximum parameters, or use the standard deviation, which you talked through, to highlight data points in a large table of data, and just using Excel to do that.
Yes, absolutely, Emma. I absolutely agree. I mean, you can eyeball a little bit. It should jump out at you, but you can't count on that. So, yes, just as she says, using standard deviation to highlight that will point them out to you. Very good.
Well, I was dredging up distant memory from my days of studying statistics, and if I remember correctly, 95% of a typical population lies within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So if you work out what 2 standard deviations are from the mean, you need to use conditional formatting in Excel to highlight those outliers for you automatically.
Very good indeed. Well remembered there, Chris. That's taking me back to my O-level statistics. Or GCSE.
Going back a few years.
No. Wonderful. Well, we're going to now pass across to Dean Couchman from Injixo, and Dean's going to take a look at forecasting in action and have a look at how you can use web-based tools to help you achieve forecasts. So, Dean, if you'd like to put your slides, your screen up, would be great.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. So recently at Injixo, we've been looking into a way of sort of tackling Penny's most recent slide, which is, that time-consuming aspect, and see, going into all that detail and refining it back out. And as you can see here, we've introduced a new forecast tool called the Injixo Forecast. So this is on top of our old structure we always used to use. The idea and the principle behind it was to make everything as flexible and as quick as possible, with needing as minimal clicks and interference from the user. So you've always got an up-to-date forecast at all times. So like here you can see there's some quick bullet points here, but it's constantly a reforecasting automatic engine that we're using. So it's always on, always up to date. It's looking at all your trends for your historical data for as much as you have. And then it's a self-learning algorithm. And as you can see here, we're using recursive mean squared error and difference mapping at the same time. So it's self-evaluating itself all the time. The only interface that you will need is when it analyzes its forecast accuracy or highlight the actual quality of the forecast it's producing based on that history. And as you can see here, we mentioned the red, amber, green indicators, and it highlights the anomalies that could be bringing that quality score down. So if I just flick over to my other screens here, I've got running. This is Injixo Forecast. Now this was only launched very recently by ourselves, but all I've done here is throw, I believe, about 18 to 2 years worth of history straight into the system. And instantly, if you looked at those historical trends, the patterns, the volumes, and it's instantly tried to run a forecast for us. And that forecast it has run for the next 10 years. Obviously, that historical data hasn't had some of those refinements it needs. So you can see the different quality scores for all the different types of contacts and the different queues and call pots that we have. Going further into here is obviously what's brought this quality down. And obviously you can see the exceptions for each of the areas. Where are those, those lacking points that just need that refinement? And this is a bit we try to make as simple as possible. Let the system highlight the pieces that's causing those inconsistencies to you. So I've just got some of the screens already loaded here, but when you click on any of those, it'll come into the forecast as we see here. And you can see at the very top, it's breaking down that overall score both into, in this case, volume and average handle time. So I'll see we've got the timeline at the bottom. We can view any period of history, any period of that future forecast, and we can factor and review those times of the day and those intervals where something's unusual. I think that's the best way, like Penny mentioned earlier, it's an anomaly. However you refer to that trend of being broken, is it too high, is it too low, is the volume greater than expected or under? Now, when we look, obviously we've got the forecast here, that's being based on all those anomalies not being factored in, factored out. So if I hit on like this little eye icon next to the volume here, it actually will tell us that the self-evaluation, the actual quality count at 96%, the reliability is actually 99. However, there are a few exceptions in the historical data that need reviewing. And as we go further down, we can see that I've got a problem here with my data is that I have to keep this feed alive, I haven't done it for a couple of days. So it's saying there's a moderate gap between historical data and the forecast. Basically between right now and when my last bit of history came in, there's a bit of a gap there. We need to, fill that gap up if it's available. Obviously, if you have, we connect to the ACDs and we bring all that data in automatically, but if something's happened, it's identifying it for you. Going a little step deeper, what we can also do is bring up a list of those exceptions as well. So you can see I've just got the exceptions tab selected on the right-hand side in your screen. And it's broken down, still on the inquiries area in my business here, and it's got broken down, on New Year's Eve, there's a 12-hour exception for all my opening hours. I could click on that and say there was no volume. It's not expecting that to have happened because we haven't told it it's going to be happening. Same if I go further down, if it's just a part of a day, I should hopefully have one here, there we go, Tuesday the 8th, we've got a problem with the volume between 5:30 and 6:45 and also between 11 and 11:45. We can view those and you can see in this nice clear interface that we've got, there was a massive ramp down happening at that period of time. So something there has driven the call volume a lot lower. And all the system needs to know is, do we include that information? It might not be part of the trend you're expecting, but it is just what happened. And there's no real influence behind it, so it's not a marketing campaign, it's not an influence from bad weather or something like that. Something external, it's just the way the business is might be changing. So what we could do is hit the ignore button, and it's not an exception, just factor it in as normal. But what we could do, if it was due to a particular reason, is create a special event. So I can just put a name next to it. So we could call this ACD outage, just for a part outage for a couple of seconds. I could save that event, and then when I come back to my forecast, so I'll just skip the screen refreshing itself, I can then come into this forecast, and if we know there's going to be some, maybe we're planning an outage for a future period, you can add those in very quickly and easily. So I can just put in ACD, I can type properly, and we can pick, obviously it's going to affect the inquiries and calls offered. I can pick the dates and time range, and the system will instantly understand that there's that reference point in the past, or multiple reference points if you tag numerous instances of the same event. You can mark it into the future if it's say a marketing campaign of type A, B, C or D, whatever you call them, and the system will automatically factor that forecast and the history and update everything accordingly for you. So immediately after that, you'll constantly have a brand new forecast, and it will have updated, so you can run your requirements if needed again, and your schedule updates and everything you need to know immediately. And like I said, we're running automatically a 10-year in advance forecast through the system, and it's doing that in, it's always on. It's always there. As new history comes in, it's instantly analysed and can help predict even the change for maybe tomorrow or this afternoon or this evening. It can do that sort of work for you as well. So it's very fluid, very quick and very accessible. There's no hundreds of options to worry about, have I selected the right amount of times to run a simulation. It's just always there for you. Now, I do have a couple of slides which I'll be presenting on behalf of Chris here, so I'll just get those ones up. So let me just go to the next one. And so Chris, over to yourself.
Thanks, Dean. Okay,
No
well, hopefully that gave you a bit of a flavour. Hello, hello. Am I still muted?
No, we can hear you.
You're good.
Surely good. I'm getting paranoid about this muting now. So thanks, Dean. And hopefully I gave you a flavour for what Injixo Forecast can do for you, addressing some of the points that Penny raised earlier. We are delighted to have been awarded place number 4 in the Call Centre Helper Technology Awards 2014. So we're delighted to be able to put this award-winning badge against our name. We were the top voted workforce management system and number 4 overall in the poll, so we're very pleased about that. A key differentiator about our solution is that we are a true cloud vendor. So what does that mean? It means a couple of things. First of all, Dean mentioned the fact that Injixo Forecast is always on and always up to date. That is possible by exploiting the power of cloud computing. It's not, you don't need to have a great big server in your server room doing this. We take care of all that in our cloud operation. It also means that we're continuously launching innovations like Injixo Forecast. There isn't an annual big bang maintenance release they have to wait for and keep your fingers crossed that new features will be in. As soon as new features are available, you log in the following day, and there they are. So we launched in Jigsaw Forecast about a month ago, and it was instantly available to all of our customers. A little earlier in the year, we launched our new agent portal, which works perfectly on smartphones, such as iPhones or Android devices. So a couple of benefits of that being a cloud application there. The other good news is the price. Workforce management historically has been quite expensive, a big capex purchase, and now we're talking about £9 per user per month, inclusive of everything you need to be running with the system, including a minimum uptime guarantee. And because it's an OPEX item, no need for capex budgets, the implementation is very streamlined, and you can flex up and flex down. We've been talking about seasonality during the call today. Quite often there's seasonality in the number of agents, and you can buy your workforce management that way now from Jigsaw. I think there's one final slide, Dean, and then I'm done.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Chris.
No problem. So just to let you know, thanks for attending today, but we do run a live web demo every Friday, including tomorrow at 11 o'clock. It's a deep dive lasting 90 minutes, and if you'd like to attend, just drop me an email and I'll send you joining instructions. You can also search for Jigsaw on YouTube, and there's a combination of product fact videos and customer testimonial videos for you to have a look at if you're interested. And that's me done.
Over to you, Jonty.
Hello, Jonty.
I think Jonty's put himself on mute.
Here's it.
Penny,
here's a very good question for you, and that is, what would be the daily call volume required to get a reasonable forecast, would you say, Penny?
Well, that's one of those questions that I'm going to give a standard consulting answer. It depends. It's not so much the forecast. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the volatility and the variation in it. So it's hard to say.
But I think
it's not
I mean,
the daily volume, it's the interval volume that's important as well, Penny, I would guess as well. If you've got one or two calls in an interval, it's going to be highly unreliable.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if anyone in the audience has got any views on this. Some people have said to me 3 years worth, but I would hope it would be possible to get a reasonable forecast ahead of that. Chris, I've got a question for you, which is, can Jigsaw Workforce Management be expanded to incorporate back office processing work? So is it just
Absolutely.
for calls?
No, it's absolutely not just for calls. I think Dean's screen hinted at some of the other channels that we can handle. There was a web chat forecast in there, but obviously back office is a big topic at the moment with lots of our customers planning both forecasting and scheduling for back office, so the answer is yes.
And here's a tip from Ian, who said, another way of measuring accuracy is hit rate. How many or what percentage of forecasting periods are on target or within acceptable variation? So Penny, there's I guess that's a sort of almost like a variant on standard deviation, but that's perhaps a slightly easier way to express it.
And this is good because this is one of the ways that we also look at, did you meet your service, your speed of answer targets or not. Again, it's not just what was the average at the end of the day, but how many periods of the day did you hit your goal within an acceptable range. So that's another way to look at your forecast accuracy. That's a great tip.
And Lisa says, remember to use your gut instinct with your forecast. All the maths in the world cannot produce a forecast. So yes, the maths is important, but in fact, doing a manual sanity check is really quite important on those. Ralph, on a similar line, make sure the data used for forecasting is CUIKA, collected, usable, integrity, knowledgeable, and action. There's a great one here. Emil said bi-weekly or monthly handshake meetings with representatives from marketing, collections, etc., where planned events get discussed and signed off. Anything not planned gets noted as a deviation when looking back at historical information. So, Dean, I think that ties in quite nicely with your building links with other departments. Just take a couple of quick ones. If you create your forecast manually on a regular basis, stop updating if you've managed to create a forecast that is close to actually what happens. only updated again when it starts to vary again. So that's an interesting evaluation there. I suppose there's always a danger. It's forecasting can be a bit like growing a little plant, isn't it? Where you have the plant in the soil and you lift up the roots to see if it's still growing. Where
How true.
and going through. And an interesting one from Mike. Ensure the IT team communicates changes to the workforce management team. Experience has shown that system changes frequently cause AHT impacts, especially at the start of the shift. If it occurred immediately following a weekend or a holiday where volumes are higher, advanced knowledge will allow for pre-planning. So I think some great tips overall. We're reaching the end of the call. In 1 or 2 words, what did you like best about today's webinar? If you put that into the chat room. If you'd like a copy of the slides, they're on the website. If you go to callcenterhelp.com/recorded webinars, you'll be able to see them there. If you'd like to watch the replay, it's on the same link as we've dialed in today. And just it remains me to say thank you to our presenters. Penny Reynolds, thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Jonty.
Thank you to Dean.
Thank you, Jonty. Absolute pleasure.
And thank you also to Chris Steely.
You're very welcome, as always.
So thank you for everyone for joining in. We're going to be looking at 30 contact center tips same time next Thursday. Goodbye, and thank you for joining. And don't forget to fill the survey on as you leave. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.